Endeavor Publishing presents The Evil in Devil's Creek by Paul B. Kohler. Produced by Paul B. Kohler and Global Endeavor Publishing. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. For more great stories and audiobooks, subscribe to this channel, and don't forget to click the notification button.
Nothing like the open road, is there? Sheri snapped her gum, reaching across the leather-trimmed console to squeeze Owen's knee. He raised his leg slightly and glanced at his attractive passenger. At just shy of 50, she was slim and vibrant. Her auburn curls swayed as they raced down the road. On either side of their convertible, cacti peppered the landscape, along with massive rocks and huge stretches of gleaming sand. "Brody made a good choice coming down here," Owen agreed. "Can't believe it's taken me this long to con you into letting me meet him." "Huh." Sheri tilted her head and smiled. Meeting my son was always going to be a huge step. And finally, here we are. "Here we are," Owen echoed, giving her a crooked smile. Brody was Sheri's son, a junior at Chaffee College. In the 3 years since Owen had met Sheri, during which they'd broken up and gotten back together more times than he could possibly remember, he'd grown accustomed to Brody's photographs on the mantle at her home. There were the high school photos in his basketball uniform, the large photograph of him and his, now deceased, father at an old piano, their fingers dancing across the keys. But during those 3 years, Brody hadn't been around when Owen and Sheri had been on again. Owen lifted Sheri's hand and kissed the tips of her fingers. She shifted, growing pensive. "I can't wait to meet him, Cher," Owen said, trying to convey his intentions. He had sensed her jitters growing as they pushed further down the road. "And I'm a good guy, right? Brody's going to like me. I can feel it, yeah?" He turned to Sheri, holding her gaze. "And don't even get me started about you." Sheri tried to smile, but she just looked uneasy. "I know. Look at me, not freaking out. And it's been hours and hours since we left." "Honestly, I expected the big meltdown to happen by now," Owen laughed. "Maybe it's a sign? This is the right time." He paused, thinking about how to broach the subject of their current relationship status. She leaned across the console and brushed her lips against his cheek, then kissed his ear, whispering, "I can't wait till we get to the hotel room tonight." Owen felt his heart and his pants swell with sudden, unquestionable lust. He gazed at her, his eyebrows raised, imagining the night ahead. They'd have the dinner with Brody, discuss all the relevant topics. How's school going? Are you seeing anyone? That sort of thing. He'd pay the bill, one that was sure to be whopping, nothing he couldn't handle. And then he'd lead Sheri back to their hotel room and make love to her. While he imagined how the night would unfold, he saw Sheri's expression change from flirtatious to terrified. She screamed, "Watch out! You're going to hit!" Owen snapped his attention back to the road, finding himself staring into the eyes of a large black dog. Owen didn't have time to yank the steering wheel to the side. His Porsche barreled into the dog, a scream-like sound coming from the animal's throat. Owen's heart was beating wildly as he slammed his foot on the brakes. When they finally stopped, Sheri gripped Owen's arm and stared into his eyes with more terror than he'd ever seen. "You hit the boy!" Sheri cried. "You hit a boy!" "No, Sheri!" Owen sputtered. "Don't be crazy, that was just a dog." "I know what I saw," she screamed again, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You killed him. You must have." Owen felt the warm desert breeze on his face. For a long, horrible moment, he imagined he'd done what she said, that it had been a child, standing in the middle of the road. But no, of course not. He shook his head. "I think you're imagining things," Owen said, his voice soothing, trying to reason with her. "I'm not," Sheri said, near hysteria. "And don't call me crazy. Let's just have a look, okay? We'll go see what it was." "Excuse me if I don't want to go see a dead boy in the middle of the road," Sheri spat. Sweat was beginning to bead along her temple. "I can't believe this, Owen. You've really fucked us." For a long moment, Owen wasn't sure he recognized the woman beside him. All feelings of lust, of possible love, had vanished, being replaced with utter confusion. He got out of the car and strode toward the back while Sheri continued to mutter to herself. Owen tried to block her out, knowing that she'd calm down. He'd known she was moody when they started dating. She'd freak out, and then right herself in minutes. The dog was just a few feet from the back of the Porsche, stretched out across the pavement. His eyes were darting back and forth, and he was panting heavily. Owen knelt beside him, sighing to himself, seeing the gash, blood dripping from the wound. "Baby, it's just a dog, all right?" he called. He heard Sheri's door open, then the clack of her heels as she crept around the back of the car. Owen looked up as she approached, her apparent relief quickly turning to concern. "Oh," she crooned. "Oh, you poor baby." She kneeled next to Owen and touched the dog's cheek. "Did you check its collar? Does it have a name?" Owen hadn't even thought to look. Upon review, the collar was quite elaborate, embellished with black, white, and dark blue feathers, along with several stone beads that flashed in the sunlight. He gestured at the decorated collar and said, "No address, no name, no nothing, just for show." "Someone certainly cared for him," Sheri said, wiping the back of her hand across her runny nose. "But God, I swear, Owen, there was a boy with him. Do you think he was tossed off into the brush?" She scanned the side of the road. The shoulder was covered with scuffed grass, burnt and dead. "Look, Sheri," Owen sighed, trying to reason with her. "There wasn't a kid, all right. It was just a dog. This stupid dog, running in the middle of the road. I think we should just move him off to the side and get on our way. He's on his last legs here." Sheri's eyes flashed with anger. "We're not going to leave the animal you nearly murdered out here to die," she said. "Sheri, please," Owen begged. "It's not that I want that either. It's just, we made those reservations, and we've been—" "Oh, please, I don't care about your stupid reservation. That's your game, trying to get on Brody's good side." She brushed her hair back, allowing her eyes to close. "I can't believe what I'm hearing." Owen leaned closer and put an arm around her waist, trying to calm her down. "Shh," he whispered into her ear. At their feet, the dog continued to pant in distress. "Listen," Sheri whispered, leaning into him. "He's still here with us. I think we should at least take him to the nearest town. They might be able to save him. I don't know why we wouldn't just try." Owen sighed. After debating with himself, he looked regretfully at his gleaming silver Porsche. The leather seats were perfect, spotless. Until now, he hadn't allowed anyone to sit in it with so much as a takeout coffee. Once, Sheri had started to open a candy bar, and he'd not so kindly asked her to toss it out the window. That sparked an entirely different argument. But this was different. He knew that Sheri would never forgive him if he left the dog out there to die. "Fine, sure. Let me move some things around in the trunk." "The trunk?" Sheri was outraged. "No, he can ride up front with us." Owen's eyes nearly bulged out of his head. "Out of the question," he said. "Not in the new Porsche. Come on, Sheri. I'll take him into town because it means so much to you, but—" "What about on the floorboard next to my feet?" Sheri pleaded. "No, that's not going to happen," Owen said, hearing the edge in his voice. The sun was high in the sky. Sheri's hair almost seemed to glow, bizarrely orange, almost cartoonish. "It's the trunk or it's nothing." Before she could respond, a shadow passed over them. Owen looked up and saw an enormous crow spiraling through the air. He staggered back, pulling Sheri closer. "What the?" Sheri gasped. The crow drifted across the sky, easing down toward them gradually. After a final turn, the crow began to descend. Its head was covered with what seemed like human hair. Its wings glistened, glossy and black like dark water. Its hazel eyes, almost human, seemed to focus on Owen, judging him and discarding his presence. The crow swooped in, burying its talons in the dog's neck. With a lunge, the crow began to peck at the dog, whose labored breathing turned into yelps of pain. Sheri screamed, covering her mouth in horror. The sound galvanized Owen. He jumped at the bird. "Get out of here!" he cried at the crow, waving his arms. "Back off!" The crow regarded Owen. For a moment, Owen was nearly certain it was grinning at him, almost saying, "Come at me. I'd love to see you try." But then it issued a single harsh caw and flew away. Owen's heart hammered. The only sound now was the dog's anguished whimpering. "All right," Owen said. Let's get the dog in the trunk. Back behind the wheel, Owen forced himself to calm down. Sheri was still fidgety, her attention on the noises. In the trunk, the dog continued to pant, occasionally thrashing about, probably bleeding everywhere. Still about 25 miles till the next town, Owen said, pressing his foot harder against the accelerator. I think we can make up some time, though. Maybe even make that reservation. Sheri's response was far away, lackluster. Owen sensed she still believed they'd hit a child back there. He needed to find a way to snap her out of it. Why don't you tell me about Brody's school? Owen asked, making his voice higher-pitched, friendlier. Why did he choose it? So far away from home? Sheri readjusted in her seat, blinked and looked at him. She sniffed. Why? Because I want to know, Owen said, forcing himself to stay cheerful. No, you don't, Sheri snapped. You've never even asked about it before. You're just trying to distract me from… Come on, Owen cut her off, his frustration starting to show. Just tell me, it'll pass the time. After a long, shuddering sigh, Sheri looked away from him and crossed her arms. Well, you know, they call it Chaffee College because it was built on an old Indian reservation. In the trunk, the dog rumbled around. Owen tensed, thinking about the damage the mutt was doing, and his fingers tightened on the wheel. It took nearly all his self-control not to pull over and toss the dog into the brush. Is that so? He tried to mask his irritation. Sure. Long story short, some of our white asshole ancestors took the land from them and built the school. Named it after the tribe. Here, I have something. She reached for her large leather purse and pulled out a small booklet. She opened it and read aloud. After more information than Owen wanted to hear, Sheri began to wind down her recital. Gary Mathers struck up a deal with the Chaffee tribe, promising that the land would remain sacred. Unfortunately, several years after Mathers' death, the Chaffee burial ground was annexed, and today the land is baseball fields and basketball courts, on which the college students now play. She paused for a moment. Sounds pretty typical, I guess. What? Owen asked, hardly listening. Not respecting the wishes of the native people, Sheri said. Even you back there. You wouldn't have brought this dog along if I hadn't made you. You don't respect anything other than yourself, Owen. You never have. I mean, look at this machine. She gestured around the Porsche, but Owen pointed, no longer listening. Look, we've reached it. The sign for the town, Devil's Creek, flashed by. As they passed it, the dog bumped against the side of the trunk, squealing sharply. Reached what? Sheri asked, looking up. The town, see? A little distraction, it was all you needed. Sheri didn't say anything as Owen eased the car onto the first street they came to. The street signs were rickety and crooked, faded building on either side of the street, but it was a town instead of wide stretches of nothingness. Then Sheri said, Don't patronize me, and glared at him. Owen's smile faltered. He looked at her aghast. I knew what you were doing, distracting me, sure. But I thought you actually wanted to know about Brody's school. For once, you actually asked about him. For once, you cared. Owen pulled over, a wave of annoyance washing over him. After a pause, he forced himself to smile. Okay. Listen. He held his palms up, as if surrendering. I am interested in Brody's school. I really am. We're heading there right now, aren't we? He put a hand on hers, rubbing gently, trying to placate her. But she yanked it away, irritated. We can't just leave the dog at the edge of town, she said irritably. Keep driving. Let's find someone. Someone who can help. Inwardly rolling his eyes, Owen hit the gas pedal and started down the street. As he drove, he started to notice an eeriness to the community, almost a darkness. They still hadn't seen a single person, a single moving vehicle. There were a few abandoned cars, leaning sideways, their glass shattered. The yards they passed were overgrown, unkempt, wild. As Owen leaned forward, he didn't see a single light in any of the houses. Has it always been like this? He asked. Just keep going, Sheri sighed. Owen turned down a larger street, possibly an avenue, finding the welcoming sign of a nearby gas station. He turned in, feeling his tension ease. What are you doing? Sheri snapped. Maybe we should ask the clerk for directions, unless you know where the animal control is. I'm not getting service out here. He waved his cell at her, a gleaming brick, relatively speaking. Sheri leaped from the car before Owen was properly stopped, and he exclaimed, "Hey!" But she ignored him and headed for the entrance. Her anxiety was turning her into a bitch, Owen thought, but held his tongue. They wouldn't have to be there long. As Sheri entered the gas station, Owen glanced up at the gas price. With a jolt, he realized the gas was nearly $2 cheaper than it had been in the last town. Grabbing his wallet, he followed her into the convenience store. Inside, the place was ransacked, the shelves nearly stripped of food, and the water and other beverages were gone. Sheri stood at the counter and rang the bell repeatedly. God damn it. How do you stay in business if you don't even bother to come to the register? She sounded angry and ragged. Sheri, Owen said. His fingers twitched. He instinctively wanted to put his hand on the small of her back. But he refrained, not wanting to startle her when she was in one of her moods. Notice anything unusual? Sheri whipped around, her eyes ablaze. It was clear she was on edge. Her mouth opened, perhaps hunting for the worst possible thing to say. The worst possible reaction. Huh? The place doesn't look like it's been used in quite a while. The gas price is quite a bit lower even. I don't think I've seen prices that low in, 5 or 6 years? Sheri's eyes swept the store, assessing the empty shelves. She lurched forward and grabbed a jar of pickles, one of the few things left on its shelf. She tipped it to read the bottom, and her eyes nearly bulged out. Jesus. The expiration date was 3 years ago. Owen felt his stomach clench. He stepped behind the sales counter and looked at the inner shelves, which were caked with dust. The register was open, and it was still full of cash, 20s, 5s, 1s, even a 50. He flipped through them and raised a cloud of dust that made him cough. What kind of person closes the gas station and doesn't take the cash with them? Owen asked. He looked across the counter at Sheri, seeing her arms tremble. She was still holding the pickle jar up, almost as if she was planning to toss it at his head. Her eyes were wild. He'd seen her that way before. A year ago, before she'd bolted out the door and told him they were through. The tension was thick, almost three-dimensional. Knowing he needed to find a way to bring her down, he smiled and spoke to her in soft tones. You want to take the pickles with us? Sheri snorted, rolling her eyes. With a small shrug, she put the jar back on the shelf. Just a bit creepy, isn't it? And it wasn't even boarded up. Hey, let's get going, Owen said. It's hot out here. I'm not surprised that no one's on the road. I certainly don't have the blood for it. Owen had grown up in northern Michigan, far from the unrelenting sun and achingly dry heat. He shifted, glancing back toward the road. We can knock on a few doors, maybe. Ask for help. Owen stuffed the bills from the register into his pocket and then walked to Sheri, reaching for her hand. We'll be back on the road in no time, he said. For a moment, she clung to his hand. But the moment the door opened, and that heat blasted like a furnace, she released him. Outside the gas station, a pack of dogs were howling and yelping in the distance. The sound seemed to be rolling toward them like a thundercloud. He glanced toward the trunk of his car, where he thought he could hear yelps from their own battered dog responding. Huh, sounds like feeding time at the zoo, Owen grunted, guiding Sheri back toward the car, the keys jangling in his hand. But as he looked back toward the barking, a small dark-skinned boy ducked out from behind a dumpster. He peered across the road, looking almost like a wraith, in canvas shorts, with no shirt or shoes. Owen's keys clattered to the ground. There's someone, he said, gesturing toward the boy. He bent over to pick up his keys. Sheri moaned, Are you making fun of me? Owen blinked. As he straightened, he realized that the figure he'd thought was a boy was just another black dog, scrappy and wild. It yelped at them, then scampered back behind the dumpster. What the? Owen stuttered. You're seriously carrying on about me thinking that dog was a boy? Sheri asked, her voice tart. No, Owen said honestly. I really thought I saw a kid. Jesus. He tousled his hair in disgust. Maybe this heat's getting to me. Sheri glared at him briefly, then slipped into the passenger seat. Let's stop wasting time, Owen, she said. That dog's bleeding out for nothing." Owen cranked up the engine and pulled back onto the main road. He turned down a side street into a neighborhood, and the barking grew louder, more insistent, ominous. "I want it to stop," Sheri shrilled. "I want the noise gone, Owen. Just put the top up." Owen stopped in the middle of the road and tapped a small button near the steering wheel, bringing the top up over them like a shield. The moment it clamped into place, the sound of the yipping dogs quieted, but didn't diminish completely. Sheri flicked on the air conditioning, while Owen turned on the radio to hopefully drown out the remaining howls. The song was one Sheri had said she'd liked before, had even sung along with on her happier days. But not today. "What do you think happened here?" Owen asked. The road they were on had a sameness, weeds and burnt grass, its sidewalks crooked and busted out. The houses hadn't seen fresh paint or upkeep in ages, and several were standing open, the interiors like dark caves. "What do you mean?" Sheri asked, oblivious. Her eyes were empty. "There aren't even any cars on this road, Sheri," he said. "Some of the houses look like they've been abandoned for years." "There's been a housing crisis everywhere," Sheri sighed. "It probably just impacted the small towns more. I know you can't imagine it with that bank account of yours, but some people actually struggle." Owen felt suddenly flustered. "Sheri, there's something wrong with this place. We haven't seen a single soul for miles." "The only thing that's wrong here," Sheri said, her voice taut, "is your procrastination. I thought you wanted to make it to your precious dinner reservation on time. I thought you wanted to flaunt your money around for Brody." "Come on, Sheri," Owen glared at her. "You've never complained about the money before." "And I know just what Brody will think," she said, slapping her thigh. "What? That I care about you? That I want to give you nice things?" Owen asked, and revved the engine. "God damn it, Sheri. You've been restless for hours." He paused, trying to make his eyes soft. He knew better than to rile her up. "I don't suppose you skipped your meds today, did you?" "Who the fuck do you think you are, asking me about my medication?" Sheri snarled. Her teeth were bared, gleaming in the burning orange sunset. "Just back off, Owen. Let's focus on getting the fuck out of here instead." Owen didn't reply. He knew he'd crossed the line, into territory about her mental health that they just didn't talk about. For years, she hadn't given a single hint about her condition, to the reason for her episode. God, how bleary-eyed and wild she'd been, hadn't brushed her hair for weeks. It had straggled on either side of her neck. She'd looked deranged. As they sat fuming in the silence that followed, a large pack of dogs crossed in front of the car. Their black coats gleamed in the sunset. Each dog wore a feathered collar, closely resembling the dog they'd hit an hour and a half before. They could do nothing but stare, watching as the pack, 50 or 60 dogs, passed and scattered into the dilapidated neighborhood. They seemed to move with purpose, like they had a plan. When the last one disappeared behind a faded blue house, Sheri straightened up and whispered, "I'm kind of freaking out a little bit." Owen thought that was the understatement of the year. He turned off the radio. It felt superfluous and strange. His fear triggered him to drive, speeding from the neighborhood and toward the main part of town. Then he saw the first signs of civilization. On the left was a large city park with a bright green manicured lawn. It had the occasional fire hydrant, big, wide-open trees with vibrant leaves flashing in the breeze. Sheri unsnapped her lipstick and applied it for the first time in hours. Across the street from the Greenbelt, which looked remarkably like a dog park, was a large municipal center with a stone sign out front. Although they still hadn't seen a single person, Owen could already imagine an entire world inside the building. Secretaries mumbling into telephones, men in business suits shuffling papers into files. He imagined shooting the shit with whomever was seated at the front reception desk. Man, this town is a bit rough around the edges, but once you get in here, it's kinda nice. Pleasant. I can see why you like it. "Hang tight," Owen said, parking in front of the building. "I'll grab our reluctant passenger and pop inside to find animal control." "Just hurry up," Sheri said, dabbing her chin with her thumb, swiping away extra lipstick. "And if you can find a pop machine in there, grab me something." "Aye, aye, Captain," he replied, climbing out onto the pavement. He nudged the door closed and opened the trunk. The dog was lying on his old and ragged winter coat that he used when he lived in northern Michigan. The dog's tongue lolled from his mouth. "Stupid thing," Owen sighed, lifting the dog. The mutt whined softly. "It'll be over soon." Owen looked down and noticed that the dog had bled through the coat to the carpeted trunk. He felt a stab of anger. Didn't even want to come into town, he grumbled. But he knew he was better off not mentioning it. Inside the municipal building, the air felt thick and dank, as if mold was growing in the corners. The front desk was empty. He placed the dog on a table near the building directory. There were no lights on, but the windows allowed enough of a glow for him to read the directory. Courtroom A, Courtroom B, Sheriff's Dispatch, Animal Control. But as he eyed the doors in his immediate vicinity, he wasn't entirely sure where to go next. They all seemed closed, locked up. All except for one titled, Records and Information. Leaving the dog sprawled on the table, his breathing coming in sputters, now, Owen ventured inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Within, the windows were grimy, casting a greenish light. The file cabinets were ripped open, records scattered across the carpet. He picked up a file and read the words, Devil's Creek Government Employees 2005. Inside, a list of men and women who'd once held office or otherwise served their community. The names were vaguely familiar, like people he might have met in passing. Surely he'd encountered an Ian Armstrong. Andy Graham rang a bell. They were regular people with regular lives, and they were missing. As he looked around room a final time, he had the nagging feeling that someone was watching. The hairs on the back of his neck crept upward, drawing his attention back toward the hall. He dropped the folder, scattering the contents. "Screw this," he whispered. He retraced his steps to the directory, where he scooped up the dog. The moment he lifted, he felt the dead heaviness. The dog's eyes were still open, glassy, like the crow's, but the breathing had ceased. "Shit, bud. We fucking tried our best now, didn't we?" Owen began his hunt for animal control. Kicking open a far door revealed a long, narrow hallway, with a single light at the end. It was orange, colored by the approaching sunset, and gave him pause. The light at the end of the tunnel, Sheri had said once, months after her illness had made her near catatonic and afraid of love. That's what I thought when I met you. That if I could get well, you were the light waiting for me at the end. Ironically, the light was from animal control, a wide-open door revealing a sterile lobby with large windows letting in the last of the fading sun. The desk had a bell in the center, which Owen reached forward and chimed repeatedly. The sound echoed across the empty hall, bouncing against the walls. "Hello?" he called, feeling very much like he was in the center of an abandoned hospital at the end of the world. Still carrying the dog, as a kind of symbol maybe, he inched around the front desk and into the darker hallway. He could smell the wretched stench of dried blood. It was overwhelming, unavoidable, making the air thick and putrid. Morbid curiosity kept him going. The back room had stainless steel countertops and cages lining the walls. Perhaps weeks, months, or even years ago, something devastating had happened there. Stunned, Owen dropped the dog on a counter and wiped his hands on his pant legs, his mouth open in shock. The cages were all sprung, as if they'd been forced open from the inside. Blood, rusty and dirty, streaked the walls and countertops and left dried lakes on the floor. With a shaky voice, he called out again, "Hello? Is there someone? Anyone?" But the hollowness in his stomach told him he was alone. "Fuck this," he muttered. He bolted from the room and back through the desolate lobby. As he stepped back into the corridor, he heard something. A whimper, a cry. Spinning around, he frowned. He waited, listening. Sure enough, from down a stairway just off the main hall, he heard it. Something like a whine, a squeal. As he got closer, the sounds morphed into words, and when the words became tangible, real in his mind, he ramped up his speed. Someone was in trouble. "Please, someone help me!" The voice was a woman's, hysterical. Fear gripped Owen's throat. He tore down the stairs and into the depths of the municipal building, which was feeling more and more like a cage. As he got deeper into the building, light filtered away, forcing his eyes to grow accustomed to the darkness. "Keep calling," he cried when the voice stopped for several moments. "I'm nearly to you. I'm almost there. Here, the voice cried out. It was hoarse, dehydrated. Hurry! Owen reached into his pocket, drawing out his cell phone. Despite the lack of service, it did offer one potential application, the modern-day torch. Clicking it, he shone the light in front of him, allowing him to race down the final few steps. He rushed up to a door that had the large words, "Police Only," painted across it. He yanked the door open and entered, his eyes darting around the room. He felt spastic, on edge, like an animal being hunted in the forest. He didn't know why. The room was the municipal building's jail, which offered 3 separate cells. Thin iron bars separated them floor to ceiling, and a small window, perhaps 5 inches tall, illuminated each cell. In the middle cell, a gaunt woman leaned heavily against the bars, her skeletal fingers wrapped tightly around them. She was trembling, malnourished and weak. But her eyes were alert. They blinked at him, gleaming like pools. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice tired. "Oh God, help me? I didn't think I'd see another person before I died." Owen stepped closer. He was just inches from her face, inhaling the heaviness of her body odor. Once upon a time, she might have been pretty, but now her cheekbones were stark, her skin fragile. She looked ragged, worn. "What happened to you? Why are you in here?" Owen asked, his brain trying to come up with a single reasonable answer. "Who are you?" "Jesus Christ," the woman rasped. "Can't you see there's something crazy going on here? Something evil?" Owen held his hands up and stepped back. "Listen, I have no fucking clue what's going on." His heart pounded against his ribcage, but his words came slowly, separated, punctuated. "Just tell me what happened as best as you can." The girl took a deep breath. "I'm Amanda Miller. I'm a college student, but I guess that doesn't matter anymore." She swallowed. "My friend Maggie and I were in the area researching Native American cultures. We stopped into this little store on Main Street and were accused of shoplifting. Falsely, I might add." Her eyes flashed. "We've been in here about a month. They've been keeping us alive, barely. But we haven't seen another person since they tossed us in here." Owen looked around the jail cell. "And where's your friend, Maggie?" "They took her, last week. I haven't seen her since," Amanda whispered. "Those monsters." "The police?" Owen asked. "No, they're long gone," Amanda whispered, suddenly looking demonic, crazed. "The natives, the Chaffee tribe, they're back." Owen remembered with a shock when he'd asked Sheri to read that goddamn booklet. The Chaffee, this was their land, yeah? Something like a few hundred years ago? "They were extinct," Amanda gasped. "Almost mythical. Only a few signs of them even still existed until a few months ago." She trailed off. Her movements became spastic. She began to yank fistfuls of hair from her head. Owen watched in disbelief as strands fell to the floor. "You have to calm down," he said. "No, you have to understand," Amanda replied. "The research I was doing about them involved rumors of their horrific violence. Entire tribes of other natives completely wiped out, scalped, cowboys strung up to die. This was all hundreds of years ago, of course, but there are stories, rumors, mythological almost. For some reason..." She trailed off again, shaking her head. "For some reason, they're back." Owen felt a thud, a rock in his stomach. He gripped the bars between them, staring into Amanda's eyes. "I don't understand what you mean." "They're here," Amanda wailed, eyes tightly closed. "I don't know how or why, but..." She slipped to the floor, tears streaking through the grime on her face. Owen turned toward the office, hunting for something, anything to help. The small room held only a desk, wooden and scratched by what looked like raccoon claws. But on the rack above the desk, there was a key ring. "Let's not panic yet," Owen said, crossing the room. He grabbed the keys and began to fumble through them, stabbing each one into the cell's keyhole. In the back of his mind, he didn't know what to believe. Certainly, the girl was speaking from a place of panic and fear. She needed psychiatric evaluation, and quickly. But what if he was releasing the monster, he wondered. Her weeping continued. She curled into a ball, wrapping her arms around her knees. When the fifth key finally slotted into the hole, Owen turned it, burst in and wrapped his arms around the emaciated girl. She shivered in his arms. "I don't know how we're going to get out of here," she whispered. Hey, Owen said. "It's going to be okay, really. I think whatever it was you saw left a long time ago. I've been all over the town. It's virtually abandoned." Amanda's eyes widened. She leapt to her feet, looking like a child in the deep end of the pool. "They're out there," she said. "Trust me, Maggie and I thought the same thing when we pulled into town. We stopped at the grocery store to grab some food. When nobody was there to take our money, we just left with the stuff. But that's when they took us in. They hardly said 2 words to us, just threw us in this jail cell." Owen's eyebrows drew together. He was trying to link all the facts. The ransacked gas station, with the 5 years too old gas prices. The dried blood splattered around animal control. The boy who always turned out to be a dog when you gave him a second look. "Was it the police who took you in?" Owen asked. "No, it was the natives," Amanda said, glaring into the dark hallway. "They took everything we had, acted like they ran the town." Owen scratched the side of his head, remembering Sheri waiting in the passenger seat. He imagined the pack of wild dogs blasting past the car. He could almost hear her scream with terror. "I have my car out front. It'll be a tight ride, convertible, 2-seater. "You think I fucking care what kind of car you drive?" Amanda said. She was erratic, jumpy. "Let's just go." They bolted down the hallway with Owen using his cell phone as a lantern, up the steps and past the bloody chaos of animal control. Around the last corner, and the sun shone in through the glass doors, making eerie shadows crawl across the floor. Amanda stopped and took a step back. "I wonder if they're looking for me," she whispered, mostly to herself. "I wonder if—" That's when the car alarm began to blare. Owen recognized it immediately, the one they'd shown him when he'd picked up the Porsche just 2 months before. "You'll know it's yours when it goes off," the man had said. "No bastard will get away with fucking up your car if you know what I'm saying." "That's me. Let's go." Owen ran toward the foyer and entrance of the municipal building. When he got to the stone steps in front of the building, he froze in sudden horror. He felt as though someone had reached into his ribcage and squeezed his heart. Amanda stopped short at the sight, huffing to catch her breath. Jesus Christ. The convertible top had been ripped from its hinges, yanked back and shredded. The passenger door was open. The glass was shattered on all sides of the car. It flashed in the sunlight, looking like glitter. "Son of a bitch," Owen muttered, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Just across the street in the dog park were a dozen or so Native Americans in feathered headdresses, with war paint across their faces. They were uttering a sort of war chant that rose in volume as the sun continued to set. "It's the 𝙤𝒊𝙩', Amanda cried. She rushed down the steps and darted across the parking lot toward a group of trees. But as she ran, she stumbled slightly and slowed to correct her stride. One of the 𝙤𝒊𝙩 pulled an arrow from his quiver and knocked it. "Run, Amanda!" Owen screamed. "Run!" The arrow leapt from the bow in a fluid arc, burying itself in her shoulder. She dropped to the ground and wailed, writhing in pain. Quickly, 2 of them descended on her, one tossing her over his shoulder and carrying her back to the park. Owen was virtually paralyzed. His eyes shot left, toward his precious, wrecked car. For the first time, he saw the fluttering red hair of his Sheri, as another 𝙤𝒊𝙩 flung her over his shoulder and carried her into the crowd. The chanting had grown more insistent, wilder. A wall of them began to approach him, taking slow, measured steps. They were hunting him. He could run, but they would soon find him. He knew they would catch him. It wouldn't take long, their eyes seemed to say. Owen began to backpedal toward the municipal building, but before he could duck back through the door, an arrow passed him, slicing through his shirt. It grazed the side of his waist, a dark stain spreading across the fabric, joining the blood left by the dog. He looked like a murderer. He looked wild, wide-eyed, manic. He was no longer in control of his thoughts or reactions. His body was moving on autopilot. Once back inside the municipal building, He bolted down the hallway. He remembered another, smaller hallway that thankfully emptied out into an alley. He didn't break stride when he hit the door. And once outside, his pace increased. Blood continued to trickle down his side. The anticipated pain was numb, as if it was happening to someone else far away. The alley funneled him away from the municipal building to a side street, and he found himself racing along a ragged length of sidewalk. Sensing eyes on him, he began to zigzag down the street, ducking between dilapidated houses. The dogs began to howl. They were behind him, and they had his scent. The dogs gained ground. As Owen darted down another street, he saw that he was nearly to the highway. Stars began to twinkle, peppering the darkening sky, and he increased his pace. His shoes, Italian leather, mind you, gripped the sidewalk and propelled him forward. The dogs were relentless. He could hear them yipping to one another, not far behind. As he crested the roadway, he ripped into the left lane, ready to flail his arms at any approaching cars. Surely there would be someone on their way to the university, some passing nobody who'd let him leap into their car and whisk him away. He was so entirely sure that someone would come for him that he didn't even consider the alternative. He didn't even recall that the entire trip through the Southwest, his Porsche had been alone. It had been just him and Sheri, into the wind and the impossibly blue sky. Why hadn't he seen it as a sign? As he ran down the 2-lane highway, not a single moving vehicle could be seen in either direction. He felt despair settle into his chest. He staggered to a halt. As he glanced to his left, he saw what looked like a large salvage yard. After just a moment's pause, he headed down the embankment and into the yard, thinking that he could at least hide there until a better alternative presented itself. He could still hear the dogs behind him on the highway. In the last of the dying light, he hurried through the salvage yard. As he took in his surroundings, he realized something about the cars. Every single vehicle was busted out and ravaged, much like his Porsche back at the municipal building. Another convertible had been peeled open, just like his. He shivered. He began to check the license plates. They were mostly out of state, which seemed bizarre to him. Some of the plates were still valid, while others were only recently expired. Why? Why would a random junkyard in the middle of Arizona have so many cars from Michigan, Texas, Ohio, Tennessee? Why wouldn't they have removed the plates? He staggered forward between two of the cars, a bright blue van with a missing windshield and a smaller red car. He collapsed against the van, trying to catch his breath and listening for sounds. He could still hear the dogs in the distance, howling and barking. But it sounded like they were spreading out, some of them closer to the junkyard. He pursed his lips, trying to make his breathing quiet. He tried to imagine what he could possibly do, how he could possibly survive. And there was Sheri to consider. Despite her erratic behavior earlier, the way her eyes had turned volatile and wild when he'd tried to soothe her, he still loved her. He still felt everything he'd ever felt, didn't he? The way they hammered their bodies against one another, late 40s with nothing to lose, told him that this was special. This was worthwhile, wasn't it? But he could just flee. He remembered there was another country road about a mile back. They'd flown past it on the way toward town, and he thought he remembered seeing dots of houses, surrounded by deserts and fields. He'd surely seen a car or two back that way. He imagined arriving there, dusty and sweating and reeking, collapsing on the pavement. Someone needs to investigate that town up the road, he'd say between gasps. There's something strange going on. Already, he could taste the dinner they would feed him. He could imagine the relief. And going back for Sheri would negate all of that. As he contemplated things, Owen climbed on top of the van. He rose up on his feet and looked out around the yard. In the distance, he could see the dogs hunting, searching for his scent. A few of them had begun to move toward the salvage yard, perhaps leading the others along with them. Owen looked away from the hunt, across what appeared to be thousands and thousands of wrecked vehicles, as far as the eye could see. The dogs began to howl. They'd picked up his scent. Owen stepped onto the next car in line, the smaller red one, then leapt to the next. The cars shook beneath him, but made little sound as long as he kept his movements deliberate. He reasoned that the dogs wouldn't be able to smell him if he kept off the ground, especially since the bleeding from his waist had stopped. He spent the next minutes putting as much distance as he could between himself and the dogs. Every car he crossed was differently devastated, but each had the same broken glass glittering from the interior. Each had a separate story of loss. He imagined the unsuspecting men, women, and children riding to their deaths. He imagined that their fate was much the same as Sheri's would be. Owen's eyes landed upon a tan sedan, about 5 vehicles to the right. It was resting on a flattened convertible. It would do. Fighting exhaustion, he climbed up and entered through the missing windscreen, careful not to cut himself on glass. With shock, he noticed that the car still had keys in the ignition, just hanging there, forgotten. If only it was on the ground, he might have navigated through the gridlock of cars around him. Curious now, he reached into the glove box and leafed through the insurance papers, his interest waning as he read the name of a man he'd never know. Gerald T. Wilson. Behind the insurance papers, there was a wallet-sized photograph of a young girl with yellow pigtails and large eyes. Owen dropped the photograph immediately, knowing he was staring at a ghost. He quickly abandoned the front seat and hunkered into the back, feeling that it was less personal, less someone else's space. He didn't want to think about Gerald, about where he'd been going or where he'd ended up. He didn't want to think about the kid at home missing her dad. Owen had his own fucking problems right now. He leaned his head back and gazed at the ceiling of the sedan. The barking echoed around the cars, but didn't seem to be getting closer. He couldn't imagine that the dogs could follow him all the way to the sedan. It was too far, squeezed too tight. In his own mind, he was sure he was safe. It had been this way when he'd first met Sheri. He remembered it clearly. He'd picked up a milkshake from a diner and was strolling back to his Cadillac, the vehicle he'd had before the Porsche, when he'd heard her crying. He'd leaned down when he'd passed her little white car, concerned. God, what a pretty little thing she'd been. Those big, bright eyes peering out at him, and her red curls winding around her ears. "Can I help you with something?" he'd asked her, recognizing almost immediately that she was half out of her mind. "I don't want to do it anymore," she'd whimpered, looking almost feral. "I don't know what you're battling, but you shouldn't have to deal with it alone. You don't have to do it," he'd responded, his voice soft. Reaching into his pocket, he'd drawn out his business card. "Listen, I'm a psychologist." She'd scoffed at him, then laughed at herself, flushing bright red. Jesus, am I really making a fool of myself in front of a therapist? I must be insane. But she had been. After the first few sessions, Owen had been stricken with fear, knowing he was falling for her, yet knowing, beyond anything, that she should be committed. She was volatile and strange, apt to hurt herself and others. When she'd pushed her own 16-year-old child, Brody, into oncoming traffic, the DA had pled her out. In return, she'd gotten more therapy. When they'd first kissed, Owen had whispered to her that he'd keep her safe from the demons in her head. He told her he'd always be there to hold her. He went against all of his training to be with her. And now, as he hunkered in the back of an aging sedan, he didn't even know if she was still alive. It had been nearly an hour since he'd heard a single howl from the pack. In the back of his mind, he supposed that the dogs must have returned to the dog park in town. He climbed out of the sedan and dropped to the dusty ground below. In the distance, he saw a warm glow and began to trudge toward it. He needed to figure out where the other road was and come up with a plan. Working his way through the wrecked cars, he continued to reminisce. The day he'd come home, and Sheri had sliced open her wrist with a piece of broken glass. Blood everywhere. "I wanted to kill him when I pushed him in front of that car," she'd whispered over and over again. Owen had cleaned her up and bandaged her. "Brody's at school now," he'd told her, stroking her hair. "He's fine. He's building a life of his own now, so you can focus on you, getting better. You can focus on us." Owen had been delusional, perhaps his entire life, thinking he could fix people. A therapist? Fuck. He couldn't even keep it in his pants for his own patients. As he approached the light, he felt brain dead from exhaustion. On some level, he imagined he was heading toward civilization. But as he got closer, it became clear that the light was in a sort of clearing at the center of the junkyard. The cars had been organized into a semicircle, facing the light. At the center of the derelict amphitheater was a circle of fire, a blaze that reeked of engine oil. The firelight flickered across the cars, giving an eerie, end-of-world quality to everything. What Owen saw in the middle of the fire circle made his skin crawl. There were several wooden posts jutting into the darkness of the sky. On the posts hung 3 human forms, all bound and gagged. 2 of the bodies were covered in blood and grime and had been stripped completely naked. The third was decomposed beyond all recognition and missing an arm. Owen felt his stomach churn. He nearly vomited behind a car, but was able to keep his mouth clenched tight. Moving forward, he avoided the sight, not wanting to believe what he'd seen. But as he approached the circular fire, it was clear one of the 2 women was Sheri. She was moaning quietly, her feet hanging a full 2 feet from the ground, twitching slightly. Owen looked for a way through the ring of fire. The flames were huge and he couldn't risk jumping over them without cremating himself. After working his way around, he finally located the single, narrow path. He darted between the flames and up to Sheri. Her cheeks were sagging and blood oozed from her head. She was drenched with it. He worked his hands up her neck, finding the ropes, and began to untie them. It took him several seconds to realize what was wrong with her head. She'd been scalped. Her once beautiful auburn hair was no more. In its place was a wellspring of crimson blood, with patches of bone showing through. Her eyes were still open, but it was clear her mind had gone somewhere else. She was no longer a part of this world. "Hey, Sheri?" Owen whispered, drawing the ropes away from her arms, revealing the scar from when she'd tried her hand at suicide. He could see the small mole just beneath her belly button, which he'd memorized from hours of making love. "Sheri, it's gonna be all right," he murmured, using his therapist's voice now. "Just let me get you out of these ropes." "Don't fucking bother." A shrill voice came from the wooden pole beside her. For the first time, he looked closely at the other woman, his eyes widening. "Amanda, not you too." He recognized his own insanity. Everything had an element of the unreal to it. Amanda had been scalped as well. Blood trickled down her cheeks and neck, running down her breasts and off her nipples. "She's almost dead, you idiot," she cried. "Get me down. We can run. We can get the fuck out of here and tell the world." But Owen finished untying Sheri. He cradled her against his chest, then gently rested her on the ground, oblivious to the blood that now covered him as well. He blinked up at Amanda, incredulous. Everything stank of the decomposing body on the other side of Amanda. Surely that had been her friend. "It's the Chaffee," Amanda shrieked. "We have to go. Run!" Behind them, somewhere in the sea of cars, came a horrible roar. Owen whipped his head around, glaring into the flickering metal. "It's 𝙁𝒊𝙁𝒈, Amanda whispered. She lowered her chin, allowing her tears to join her dribbling blood. "Who the hell is 𝙁𝒊𝒊𝙁? Owen asked, his voice dazed. On the ground at his feet, Sheri had begun to twitch. Perhaps these were her last breaths. "It's their god," Amanda began to shiver. "Or their devil, maybe. Fuck. He's the devil of transition. It's why they can shapeshift. And, well..." She let out a strange, horrible laugh. "We're his offering." She turned her head back toward Owen. "Run, while you still have time." Owen reached down for Sheri, thinking he could carry her over his shoulder. But she trembled a final time, looking almost insect-like, inhuman. His stomach clenched once more. Finding his legs, he stumbled toward the direction he'd come from. As he darted through the narrow opening, he found himself staring back out into the sea of vehicles, with nowhere to turn. From the distance, a man, a beast, approached him. He was perhaps 8 or 9 feet tall, with gleaming hazel eyes and shoulders broad and ox-like. He wore no shirt, no pants, sporting instead a waistband with several hanging scalps, swinging back and forth as he walked. The moment he saw Owen, he raised his gigantic hands up and snarled, baring his teeth. Owen turned away, hoping to find another path through the fire, but only ran into a dead end. Before he could come up with another alternative, the beast was upon him, and Owen found himself dangling by one ankle over the flames. The giant's laughter roared, drowning out his own screams. Screams that would never be heard.
This has been The Evil in Devil's Creek. by Paul B. Kohler. Copyright 2024 by Global Endeavor Publishing. All rights reserved. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like and share.